It's not uncommon for children around the ages of 3 to 5 to have imaginary friends. Given that I was an only child growing up, it made even more sense to my parents that I had one. His name was Michael. To me, Michael looked like one of those blank, articulated wooden mannequins you'd see in art classes. He stood about 8 feet tall and always accompanied me on my fantasy adventures in the woods behind my parents' house in Westbrook, Virginia. We'd hide from the monstrous Jabberwock as it invaded our treehouse. We'd defeat the hordes of orcs from across the creek to save our fantasy kingdom, and we'd always make it back home in time for supper. I guess you could say one of the big differences between Michael and other imaginary friends is that he never really went away when I got older. Instead, he actually became much more real to me. There was one more thing, though. One thing that is crucial in understanding what I'm about to tell you. Michael seemed to be able to know everything about everyone we met. The first time I came to realize this was on the first day of first grade. When I was in Miss Horton's homeroom, I had just put my book bag in my cubby and was sitting at my desk while she introduced herself.
Welcome, everyone. My name is Miss Horton, and I'll be your homeroom teacher this year,
she said with a bright, welcoming smile. She's pretending to be happy. It's all an act. She just discovered her husband was having an affair, but she's too afraid to leave him. She doesn't think anyone will ever love her. I looked over to Michael, a little confused by what he meant. As a young boy at just 7 years old, I didn't know what he meant by affair or anything like that. He sat cross-legged beside me on the floor, looking right at me with his blank wooden face. He seemed to understand that I was confused by what he said, so he turned back to face her as I did the same. As I began to move up grades, I started to keep Michael more of a secret from my friends and parents. It didn't take much for someone to realize that once you stopped believing in Santa, imaginary friends didn't seem normal to hang around as well. Upon coming to this realization one day while in the 5th grade, I looked at Michael and asked him, "Are you real? Like, really real? Or are you just made up?" He looked at me in that blank, expressionless wooden face and said, "I'm as real to you as anything, my friend. All imaginary friends are real to their masters. Children's minds are powerful things capable of the most marvelous imaginations. You just so happen to be stronger than most. So that's why I can still see you and play with you?" He placed his mannequin hand on my shoulder. "Yes. But how do you know everything?" I asked. "You seem to know a whole lot about the people around me. How do you do that?" He said, waving a single finger. "That would be telling, and a magician never reveals his secrets. All you need to know is that I am your friend, and I always will be." Those years growing up with him were the best of my life. We'd had so much fun messing around with the other kids in school, I was able to make a lot of them think I had superpowers and could read their minds. That's actually how I met my 2 best friends, Ron and Patricia.
How do you do it?
Patricia whispered to me at my 14th birthday party.
Bit by a radioactive spider?
Ron nearly spit out his Coke laughing at that one. "No, but seriously, dude," he asked, wiping his mouth off. "What's the trick?" So far, no one had ever been able to see Michael. He'd always been mine and mine alone. He never really asked me to keep his existence a secret as I grew up. I just never wanted people to think I was some kind of weirdo who still had an imaginary friend. But I knew Ron and Patricia were my real friends and wouldn't judge me. I hoped they would believe me. "Okay," I said after taking them up to my room. "You have to promise not to tell anyone or think I'm crazy. I know it sounds like I am, but I promise you I'm not." "Hands on my heart," Ron said, following the motion. "I do solemnly swear to not see you as crazier than you already are." We all laughed at that. "All right, guys," I said, standing up. "I'll tell you." They seemed to come to terms with the truth about Michael rather well, Ron more so than Patricia. I think part of this was the fact that they had seen just how unusual my ability to seemingly read people firsthand was.
So you're saying that your friend is able to see and read people's minds, and only you can see him?
Yeah.
So, is he really imaginary? I mean, if he can actually do things, then he has to be real somehow.
I don't really know how the rules work, I admitted. He says that I'm the one who created him out of all my imagination, so I guess calling him an imaginary friend is the best current description for him.
Is he here right now?
Patricia asked. Yes, I replied, looking past her towards where Michael was standing over us.
All right, tell him to follow me in the closet, and then tell you how many fingers I'm holding up.
Okay, I laughed. I thought you were going to come up with a harder test.
Just do it, dork,
she said, stepping in my closet. As she closed the door, Michael nodded his head and walked through the closet. He then reappeared holding up 3 wooden fingers. 3! No freaking way, Ron shouted, jumping to his feet. Dude, you know what this means? You've got a freaking invisible sidekick that can read people's minds. That's awesome. What does he look like to you? I then pulled out a miniature wooden mannequin model from my desk drawer and showed it to him. As Patricia came out of the closet, equally excited. This is what he looks like.
Then how does he talk to you if he doesn't have a mouth?
Patricia asked. He just kind of talks in my head, I replied. But listen, guys, please don't go around and talk about this. I don't want any attention. I just want to hang out and be normal. Well, as normal as you can with a giant wooden imaginary friend. No offense, I said, looking towards Michael. None taken, he replied, giving a thumbs up. I just want you to grow up and have a good time. And for the most part, I did. Middle school went by like a breeze as Ron and Patricia and I all grew closer as friends. High school, however, is when things started to take a turn for the worst. While sitting at the lunch table with them, this run-of-the-mill senior asshole by the name of Connor Bowman decided today was a good day to screw around with the freshmen. Hey, dumbasses, he said, walking up to us with his friends. You're at our table. There's one right across from here. Just go sit there, Ron said, trying to hold his ground while not starting a fight in the process. What'd you say? Connor said as he leaned closer to Ron. Because I swear I just heard some shit come out of your mouth. He then swatted Ron's water bottle out of his hand as it spilled onto the floor. Oh, I'm sorry about that, pal. I can get pretty clumsy when I'm pissed. His mother is in the hospital, Michael said to me as he stood behind Connor and his friends. She was drunk behind the wheel when she veered off the road. She turned to alcohol because of her abusive husband. I really don't know what in God's name put the fire in my belly to say what I said next, but to be honest, I wasn't planning on starting the year off being screwed around with by a couple of dickheads who thought they were the top of the food chain. Why don't you go eat with your mom? I said, while taking a bite of my hot dog. I'm sure she can use the company in the hospital. That is, unless your dad decides to pay her a visit. They say sticks and stones may break your bones, but words will never hurt you. But those words seemed to jab into his ego like a flaming knife through butter. His face turned blood red while his eyes seemed to go completely black. You motherfucker! He started to shout as he raised a fist to me. I quickly braced myself for the oncoming blow, but it never came. Instead, there was just a quick series of wheezing coughs as Connor fell to his knees with his hands around his throat. Suddenly, I clenched my hands to my head as a shot of pain ran through it, quickly being replaced with a thudding beat, growing faster and faster with each thunderous pulse. Connor, are you okay? What's wrong? One of his friends shouted as they knelt down beside him. His eyes were bloodshot and his face was full of panic as he tried to breathe. Suddenly, he collapsed onto the floor, writhing like a fish out of water. Every single muscle in his body seemed to contort as he began to seize. Barely understand the situation as I backed away, trying to concentrate as that pulsing beat grew faster and faster in my head. His friends leaned down to try to keep him still until Connor started spewing out thick, black sprays of blood all over him, causing him to fall backwards. That's when everyone started to gather around the scene, just as he started to shake more and more violently. With a choking series of gargles, blood began to pour out of his eyes and ears. The beating in my head began to slow to a steady pace, before eventually crawling down to complete silence. As it quieted itself from my mind, a teacher rushed over to try to perform CPR on him, but it was too late. All the while, Michael continued to stare down at the bloody body with his blank, expressionless face. When he returned my gaze, that's when I knew what had just happened, and the realization dragged my heart down to my chest. Without saying anything, I quickly made my way out of the cafeteria down to the bathroom. After making sure it was empty, I rushed over to the nearest stall and locked myself inside, taking just a moment to wipe the sweat off my forehead. "Carson?" Michael asked as I saw his wooden feet standing just outside the stall. "Are you all right? Did you do that?" I whispered, rocking myself back and forth. "Yes." I knew he was telling the truth. He always did. But just this once, I wanted him to lie to me. "Why? Why did you do that?" "He was going to hurt you and your friends," he said in my mind. "His mother is going to die tomorrow. Then it would have just been him and his father until he turned 19. Then he would have turned to drugs at the age of 23. He would father 2 children and neglect them as his own father did to him. His depression would then grow to such an uncontrollable amount that after taking their lives, he would take to the streets and kill 37 others. He would then turn the gun on himself. Now, none of that will ever happen. None of those people's lives will be lost by his hand." "But how did you know that? I know you can read minds, but how do you know their future? He couldn't have been older than 18 and you just killed him." "I just wanted you to be safe and happy." "Do I sound happy?" For the first time, Michael didn't reply. He just stood there silently. "Just go away," I finally said. "I don't want to see you right now." "But Carson..." "Go away!" I yelled back, banging my fist against the stall door. When I looked back at the floor, he wasn't there. It was just me. Once the school called out to the parents, most of the students, including me, got early dismissals. After my dad picked me up, the ride home was silent. I think Mr. Blankenship, the 9th grade guidance counselor, called my dad and told him of the more sensitive details, given that I was in direct contact with Connor when he died. Ron and Patricia seemed to be understanding as well when I told them I just wanted to be by myself for a little while. I stayed in my room for the rest of the day, staring at the small model of Michael laying on my dresser. Maybe he had good intentions of protecting me, but everything that I had seen, the pain that was endured. I mean, don't get me wrong, the guy was an asshole, but he didn't deserve that. He didn't deserve to die. Eventually, I seemed to drift off to sleep and was met with the most surreal and vivid experience I have ever had. I was standing in the middle of a vast, sterile, rocky wasteland. Razor-sharp, serrated mountains towered up into the sky that was crinkled as if it was made of paper. Across the horizon before me was the ruins of a vast silver city. A storm seemed to be brewing over it, as thunder rolled over the dark clouds overhead, echoing throughout the landscape towards me. Without knowing where I was or what to do, I began walking towards it. Along the way, I passed by craters the size of small communities. Thick black smoke was still billowing out of them. The closer I came to the city, the more I could start to make out the sounds coming from it. At first, I thought it had been thunder from a storm, but more and more, it began to sound like the anguished roars of some great beast. I was starting to get worried, but had this feeling that I was safe, that nothing could hurt me. So I did what felt like the only logical thing to do. I continued on. After what seemed to be several hours, I came to the ruins of a great marble wall at least 600 feet high that seemed to surround the entire city. It looked as if a combination of some great battle along with the unforgiving degradation of time had worn it down to a shadow of its former self. Slowly, I began to make my way around the broken marble in search for a crack or break in the towering structure large enough to drag myself through. Eventually, I found a rupture about 3 feet wide at the base of the wall. I slowly began to crawl through it. The ground underneath was hard and sharp, as if made of a combination of rock and glass. The hardest part of the entire ordeal was maneuvering myself along as not to shred every inch of my body. As I came through the opposite end of the marble, I was met with a scene I still have trouble fully comprehending to this day. The city was composed of thousands of tall ruins of silver towers that stretched up as far as the eye could see. They looked as if they'd been melted away by some unimaginable, overwhelming inferno that seemed to engulf the entire city at once. Charred remains of millions of people lined the streets, preserved in motion as if they had been running and hiding from something terrible. Up above was a dark, swirling maelstrom of storm clouds that resembled a black hurricane. The eye of the storm was still much farther up ahead, but from what I could see, it seemed to be holding some kind of brilliant light that appeared to be this world's only source of illumination. As I continued to make my way through the city, I was suddenly knocked down by another thunderous eruption of roars. They seemed to be coming from the sky, from the storm up ahead, but its sheer ferocity shook the ground around me like an earthquake, causing me to stumble and fall on the ground. With a hard slice, I cut my hand on the jagged piece of glass protruding from the seared ground below me. Picking myself up and examining my hand, I saw that while in fact there was a massive burning slice in my hand, no blood seemed to pour out from it. "There's no need to worry, Carson." Michael's voice nearly caused me to fall down once again, although when I turned around to face him, I wasn't greeted by the wooden mannequin imaginary friend I've had my entire life. Instead, I was met by a tall man in a tattered white robe. What is this?" I asked him. "This is, or was, my home," he said, looking around the ruins of the city. I don't understand," I said, following his gaze. "I thought my home was your home." "For the past 17 years it has been," he said with a smile that faded quickly. "But this was my home long before." "But why am I here?" I asked. Because there are things I haven't told you, things I've been keeping from you, and given the recent circumstances, I believe you deserve the truth." "What truth? What's going on here?" I could see him struggling, either trying to find the right words or figure out where to start. "I've been your imaginary friend your entire life, but that's not what I have always been." "What do you mean?" "Before you were born, I was the imaginary friend of a Ross Bailey in Atlanta, Georgia. Before that, there was Rachel Black in Glenroth, Scotland. I have been the friend of millions of children throughout their childhoods. But before that, before all of that, I was something else. I was what you would call an angel." "An angel?" I asked. "Yes, but why did I never see you like this? Why did I always see you as some kind of wooden mannequin? When the angels abandoned this place, we lost our true form. The only way we can regain any form of physical appearance is by utilizing the mind of a child. Their imaginations are the most pure forms of power." "I'm sorry," I said, trying to comprehend everything at once. "This isn't making any sense." "I know it's hard to understand," he said, placing a gentle hand on my shoulder. "I knew that just telling you wouldn't be any good. That's why I brought you here in spirit, to show you." "But what is this place?" I asked my oldest friend. "This," he said with a sense of euphoria as he looked around the ruins of the Silver City. "This was paradise. This was heaven." "Heaven?" I asked, expecting much more from the glorious afterlife that I'd always heard so much about in Sunday school. "But what happened here?" "It was abandoned by the saints and his servants after the ethereal judgment." He then began to look up towards the burning glow at the center of the storm. "The Creator tried to scorch the whole of reality in its infinite inferno, burning everything that it had ever created away into nothingness." "God," I said, "you're telling me that God tried to destroy the universe? Why?" "The Creator, God, became insane. I don't know why or how, but it did. One day, without warning, God began to scream and howl throughout all of paradise, exclaiming that it had found its true origin, and that it had discovered the truth to it all, and proclaimed its grand design an abomination. It set forth its divine fire to smite the heavens and the earth, but the disciples of the light, along with the saints of old, rose up against it, winning the war in heaven, imprisoning the Creator in chains forged from its light of creation. Walking towards one of the charred figures who was petrified in the moment of cradling their head against the ground. It became clear that the paradise was no longer safe. In the end, the last of the seraphim evacuated the angels out of this domain to the mortal world. except without being in the presence of the Creator, we had no corporeal form. He was about to continue until suddenly the sky cracked as a thunderous, insane voice boomed from the sky, bellowing. Then a series of burning chains with links the size of skyscrapers began to fall through the clouds as the eye of the thundering maelstrom began to expand, revealing a howling stellar inferno of light that seemed to be the source of all this madness.
I will be freed.
The light soared with the sound of thunder that shook the silver towers to their core. The ground began to buckle and quake as the silver spires around us started to crack and collapse. Michael grabbed my shoulders and gave me a look of complete terror as the sky tore apart into fire above him. Listen to me. I have to do something, but I promise that everything is going to be all right. What are you talking about? I cried as the air seemed to erupt all around us. I only wanted to keep you safe, Carson. I only wanted you to grow into the amazing person I know you'll become. I knew what he was doing. He was saying goodbye to me, but I didn't want him to. Despite everything that had happened earlier, despite the universe seemingly collapsing around on us, I didn't want him to go. I didn't want to say goodbye to the one true friend that had been there my entire life. No, please! I pleaded to him. Let's just go home. There won't be a home to go to if I don't stop this. Behind him, I could see hordes of flying creatures hurtling themselves towards the ferocious inferno that was the creator and destined destroyer of all things. They quickly seemed to morph and shape themselves into molds of hard light, like into my eyes. Tears started flowing down his own. I love you. Without being able to utter a single word to him, he shoved me to the ground. Packed at the glass, I suddenly shot back up in my bed, panting with sweat caked on my clothes. Thunder exploded outside as rain poured down on my bedroom window, causing me to nearly scream in terror. Looking down at my alarm clock, I saw that it was 2:35 a.m. As I reached up to wipe the sweat away from my forehead, my hand suddenly began to sting and burn. After looking down, I saw the scarring remnants of a massive cut that had not been there the day before. It was the same cut that I had gotten while in that place. Michael? I asked frantically, looking around my room. Michael, where are you? For the first time, he never appeared. For the first time in my life, it seemed that I was completely alone. I've tried my best to carry on with myself since then. After graduating, I slowly started to lose touch with Ron and Patricia. Not that they did anything wrong, but because I wasn't myself anymore. All those years ago, I lost a major part of my life. I lost the best friend I ever had, and I've never been able to fully recover from it. But I'm trying my best, because I know that would be what he would want. But whoever you are hearing this, I want to tell you something. Whatever you do, don't let go of your imagination, because somewhere out there may be someone that needs it. A lot of theories stay theories for good reasons. Years ago, a group of us theorized what it truly meant to be human. It's been common knowledge for a long time now that we have souls. It's just no one's actually known what exactly souls are. They're comprised of energy, a substance that can't be created or destroyed. They just exist, and no one knows how or why. They don't seem to exist in this universe. Not really. They don't have a form in this universe. We can't see energy. We can't see souls. To exist, to have a hold in this dimension, the energy that is a soul needs to latch onto something that already exists here. Namely, a body. Bodies are physical entities. They have brains and neurons shooting information all over the place. They have the ability to think and feel. How much of that is the brain? How much of that is the soul? The soul can't exist in this dimension without a body, but does that mean a body can't exist without a soul? Well, that's what we had to find out. That was the first step. You see, we wanted to break nature, decode the brain. Our brains are only capable of holding so much information. It's, we theorized, why we don't remember how we were born. Unless childhood memories are stored away or completely forgotten, they're unobtainable because to bring those memories back would destroy us. You can't remember everything. It's impossible. It's also completely unethical to try, so we went a step further. AIs have been in progress for years. We know how to give a computer intelligence, but it's just intelligence. It's a mechanical brain, not a soul. You can't make a soul out of spare parts. Our theory was that if we could design a computer capable of storing millions upon millions of gigabytes worth of data, a computer larger than any biological brain could ever be, and then we put a soul inside the computer, it would be able to access every memory, every thought. We theorized that our souls remember a lot more than just this world. Maybe they know about the dimension they came from. Maybe they have memories that go back before they entered a human body. Maybe souls are reincarnated. Was it possible we could give a computer the memory of every body it had ever possessed? Like I said, the first step was to know if this was even possible. How do we find a soul? How do we lure it to a computer? We don't know how many souls are out there. It's possible the race to a human body is as intense and chaotic as the millions of sperm that race to an egg for fertilization. We weren't sure whether this would work, but our first step was to find at what point a soul entered a body for the first time. At first, it was decided that a soul must enter a body as a child is born. Some of us argued that perhaps a soul was put into a child while they were still in the womb. Could we correlate brain activity directly to the soul's input? No, we couldn't. Not yet. We had to find a way to detect a soul. It sounds impossible, but everything's impossible if we let ourselves think that way. I can't go into details. This whole project... God, the only reason I'm even telling you any of this now is because it doesn't matter. We had a machine, a device that could detect a fluctuation of energy in the area around a human being. Everything has its own magnetic field. Everything has an aura of energy around it. Not just living things, but household objects. The only difference is that in the living, the energy is more complicated. People who say they can see auras usually detect colors too. Emotions. Emotions can be felt even without a soul, but the soul is what magnifies them. It makes them palpable. Household objects don't feel. This isn't a Pixar movie. Your toys don't feel emotions. Your hairbrush doesn't have conversations with your deodorant behind your back. But living things feel, and that has helped us create the machine we needed. This took us years. We were all university kids when this started. Now, God, what are we now? We used the machine in hospitals at first. Tried to figure out when children in the nursery were first showing signs of energy fluctuation. The machine was harmless, but we still had parents sign waivers, paid off hospital personnel to keep their mouths shut. We studied the phenomenon for years, but when those years were up, we came to a disturbing conclusion. There was no correlation. Everyone was different. Some people would be born with their soul. Some people would get them years later. I studied children who were 2 or 3 without souls, some as old as even 7 or 8. This isn't a horror movie, though. Kids without souls weren't little Damians riding on the walls of their playrooms in blood. They're pretty normal, but they lack personality. You know that saying, dull as a brick wall? A lot of these kids were exactly that. They didn't have much of a personality to account for. A lot of their emotions were very standard. They were happy at birthday parties, they'd cry if a toy was taken from them, but they never developed their own style. They were never the tricksters who stole cookies from the jar on the kitchen counter. They were never the leader in their group of friends. They weren't outcasts because outcasts still demanded a variation of personality. They simply were. And it was unsettling to see how many of them existed. The oldest child we ever kept track of gained her soul at 18 years old. This presented us with many problems. We had no way to narrow down the search. We couldn't even think of finding a soul if we didn't have any way of knowing where they were or when they would enter a child or, as we found later, an adult. Communication with the soul seemed implausible at first. It existed in another dimension. How the hell did we even theorize getting one's attention? But then, one of us proposed an extra measure, a further study on the machine we created to detect energy fluctuation. We'd done that. We were able to see how energy changed. All we had to do was figure out the wavelength it ran on, and we could replicate the fluctuation. We could send a wave of sound that could effectively attract souls. There are sounds that go beyond the comprehension of human hearing. Sounds that we can create not with our voices, but with machines. This was the same idea. We had to make a sound that we couldn't detect, but our machine could. As long as the machine could pick it up, then hopefully the souls would too. This still meant we had to be in a hot spot for soul activity. We had to be around one of our case studies, one of the children who had yet to develop a soul. It was all about chance. The probability it would work was hinging on impossible, but that's what this whole experiment had run on. Impossibilities. Things that if we'd gone out in the open to the scientific community about, they would have scoffed in our faces. This was beyond impossible. This was knocking on the door of another dimension and hoping something would answer. I think it was sheer luck that won us in the end. The computer we made to be large enough to hold a fully capable human mind, the mechanical brain, and eventually the biological soul. Fortunately, this wasn't the 60s. The machine was large, but not impossible to move around. We kept it in the bedroom of our last child's study with full permission of his parents. Oh yeah, we gave the computer the same design as our new energy detecting machine. It would periodically let out a noise we believed would attract the souls. We couldn't hear anything, but a light would flash on the monitor any time the sound was released. We noted the progress, and for a long time, we got no results. 2 years into the study is when our luck finally started. 2 years in, and suddenly we got our soul. It happened so quickly, I don't really remember exactly what I was doing at the time. We were all beyond exhausted, taking shifts with the machine. I'd been talking to Hines, I think, one of the girls in our group who I was closest with. I don't remember what we'd been saying. I think she was going on about her new dog. She loved that thing. Anyway, 1 second it had been the usual silence, and then we had a soul in our computer. The screen went white, then red, then white again. The mechanics whirred and cranked in ways I'd never heard in the years I'd been running. Then, the screen went blank. Then, the computer started to scream. We couldn't afford to move the computer, so we effectively stole a family's house in the back end of nowhere to stare at a screaming computer monitor. The parents agreed to move in with their parents, with very little push on the matter. The screaming was insufferable. Thank God the next set of neighbors were about a mile down the road. We couldn't mute it, only our own ears. We'd wear earbuds, earmuffs. Hines and this other guy, Johnson, they both couldn't take it, and on day 3 they just drove into town to get away from it. Meanwhile, a couple of the hardier scientists and I stayed behind and just tried to blank it out. On the 5th day, data started scrolling down the monitor in perfect vertical lines, an infinite series of numbers that never repeated themselves once. We didn't have time to translate it. We didn't have a key. It didn't follow any numerical or mathematical rules we'd ever seen. We just hoped that if the screaming stopped, we'd be able to ask what it meant. The screaming was mechanical in nature, broken, like listening to something so off-key even auto-tune couldn't fix it, but it damn well tried. I'm surprised it didn't drive us insane. Then again, to even be attempting what we attempted, I think we'd lost our sanity long ago. On the 7th day, the computer went quiet. The soul stopped screaming, and for the first time in a week, the house fell silent. Johnson and Hines were called back. Spencer, the boss of operations, rounded everyone up. We stared at the monitor. because there was little else for us to do, and waited. In a voice like a Furby flung into a washing machine, the computer said, "Oh, where?" We were dumbfounded. We hadn't expected it to speak, though that was the most likely outcome. We might have just fused a soul and a computer together, but whatever this thing was, it wasn't a child. It had full access to the internet, to every language. It knew what country it was in, knew that everything on that computer had been coded in English. It knew what to say, but if it knew all this already, then why ask where it was? Because it wasn't asking where it was. But Heinz still said,
"You're on Earth."
The monitor flashed to life. Google Maps, of all things, appeared on the screen. In possibly the most sarcastic tone I could imagine for a tiny automated voice, the computer said, "Earth." Yeah, it knew where it was. Heinz backed away awkwardly. I put a hand on her back. The computer asked again, "Where?" Spencer didn't say anything. I think he was still too dumbfounded. No one else was offering an answer, so I stepped up. "You're not in an organic body," I said before rolling my eyes. "Obviously, you probably figured that much out already." Heinz pinched me. I scowled at her. The computer responded, "Yes." It drew the word out like it didn't expect me to respond. "What I mean to say is that you're in a computer. We put you there. We, in a sense, I guess you could say we hijacked you." Then the computer did something none of us expected. It began to laugh. It took a few days for the computer to fully come to grips with communication. Though it wasn't a child, it still needed time to learn. We didn't need to buy picture books for it. It could find whatever it wanted online, but it still liked to be talked to, even if it didn't always respond. We decided to call the computer's soul Spirit. Within a week, people started getting antsy. We'd made this computer to find out some of life's biggest questions. We'd infused a soul with technology to give it one of the largest minds out there. We were literally standing in front of the most intelligent being on Earth. Naturally, we were curious to find out what it knew. Spencer started simple. Spirit word before saying, "I know we haven't been very forthcoming with you. We were giving you time to learn, but we have questions.